Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to present the 24th Annual Peacemaker National Award to David Gergen.
Thank you. Thank you, dear. Thank you. You're really good. You're good. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, sir.
Can I hold this for you?
Sure, sure. You want to go right here. Okay, see, okay? You going to take that with you?
I'll put it right here.
You going to sit here? You're really going to sit there? No, that's fine. I'd love to have you sit there. I apologize for turning my back to you. That's all. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very, very much. Jenny, thank you for your marvelous introduction. And I also want to take a moment to thank you for the work you've done in your own nonprofit of Voices of Women. It's an organization that Jenny has started and that she's really devoted to. She's a communications guru, as I think many of you know, from New Zealand, a Kiwi, along with her husband who's here. But she's really devoted to the promotion of women's voices all around the world, especially in oppressed areas. I want to thank and salute Transcendence Dance Group. I thought we were coming to a reenactment of the West Side Story when we first arrived here, but they really have demonstrated this. I was told that young people who sometimes have a hard time expressing themselves through words can find empowerment through dance and express themselves in other ways and seek the kind of harmony that they were doing through their dance. And I'm really delighted and proud to be on the same stage with them tonight and to thank them. But most of all, I want to thank the National Conflict Resolution Center and all of you who support it for this award. I'm deeply touched by it. But it's an evening, frankly, that's not about either of the awardees. It's about the work of this center. And I think all of us have come to appreciate how important it is in this country of ours right now to build communities of civility. And there's no one who's been better at that here on the West Coast than this organization. And I thank you for supporting it. I hope that you'll come back for dinner next year, but I also hope that you'll find the envelope, which is tucked away in the program. I am sure that there are the sponsors here, Steve Dinkin, who is president, and I also want to thank Jane Scher and her family for the way they have treated me so well while I've been here. I was asked to speak a little longer tonight about the search for peace and where we find ourselves. And in truth, for most of our lives, the search for peace has been all about the world beyond American shores. As long as I've been alive, we've had young men and women who have gone overseas and sacrificed often their lives, certainly so much of their precious freedom, to support not only the security of this country, but to advance the cause of peace. The search for peace, especially during the Cold War, was one of the great success stories of America. It was a bipartisan search that was launched after the war by a Democratic President, Harry Truman, and joined in by a Republican President, Dwight Eisenhower. And throughout most of our adult lives, the parties in this country have been joined together in unison and unity in the approach toward bringing a successful end to the Cold War. One president after another devoted himself to that cause. And in the end of the day, we had a marvelous triumph. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union withdrew, and without a shot being fired at the end. No one thought. I remember back when I was a kid when we were diving into bomb shelters. No one thought it would end peacefully, but it did. And it did because the United States, because Americans, because people of both parties stuck together. And we saw it through year after year. It was not a sort of a one-shot kind of deal. We were not weekend warriors. One generation after another worked to secure the peace. And yet, do we still have conflict in the world? Yes. But the greatest threat to our lives, which was the Cold War, has ended successfully. And if you think about it, we've had the longest period of general peace in the world since you have to go all the way back to the defeat of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna in the early 19th century, to find a time that brought so long a period of general peace. And we could not have achieved that had it not been for the fact that we were unified here at home. And what I would suggest to you tonight is that as the threat of general violence recedes, that it's time, it's urgent, that we begin to restore peace and build peace here at home. That is our central mission today. All of us, I think, are aware of how dysfunctional our politics has become because it's become so acrimonious. I would suggest to you that American politics was always understood that it was going to be contentious. Our founders understood that. If you go back and read the Federalist Papers, especially James Madison, he pointed out that the very fact that we have human liberty in this country, that we have freedom of speech, invites dissent. It's important that that each of us be able to put forward his or her own views, that we be able to stand up for things, and inevitably we're going to have differences. Madison talked about the fact we were going to have factions. It was built into the system. But what the founders did was to build a system of checks and balances so that no one group could tyrannize another. And the founders also began a tradition of having acrimonious debates, but at the end of the debates, seeking ways to find harmony and resolution so that we could move on. This country was founded on compromise. It was not founded on people, fighting with each other and seeking so much purity that we can never reach resolution and never reach agreement. It was founded with the notion, and embedded in the Constitution is one compromise after another. One of the most famous compromises in American history came because there was a huge question when Alexander Hamilton was trying to put together a national government about whether the federal government, the national government, should assume the debts of the states that had built up during the Revolutionary period. And the southern states, which had paid off their debts, said they didn't want to do that because the federal government would be assuming all the debts of the northern states, and they in the South would have to help pay off those northern debts. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. What happened? Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton had dinner one night in Philadelphia, and they came to a compromise that the federal government would assume the debts. In exchange for that, the South would get the capital. And that's why the capital was moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. as part of that huge compromise. People understood that compromise is at the essence of politics. Now, we've had only one period when there was a glaring exception and when we were unable to reach compromise, and that was the 1850s, and the run-up to the 1860s. And there, the arguments over the extension of slavery to the West were so acrimonious that literally after one debate in the House of Representatives, some 30 members of the House of Representatives drew their pistols. On another occasion, a representative from South Carolina with a cane barged into the Senate, found Senator Sumner from Massachusetts, and beat him to within an inch of his life. Sumner, it took years to recover. He was an invalid for most of his life. And of course, the inability to reach compromise is what brought the Civil War. 600,000 dead, and almost brought the end of the Republic. That's where an unwillingness to find unity, to find conflict resolution will lead. And I must tell you that after attending the Republican and Democratic conventions in 2004, I came home to tell my wife for the first time, listening to the anger and the hatred coming from the podiums of those two conventions, I told my wife that for the first time in my life, I understood why we had a civil war. Because people were at each other's throats. And I don't know where this is going to lead. But I must tell you, I don't think we're in danger of civil strife. But I do feel that after 40 years in and out of Washington, trying to understand our national politics, we are closer to the edge, to a precipice, than I can ever remember. We're living dangerously close to a precipice because we're unable to resolve conflicts in our national politics. You have to look no further than the national deficits and the debt. It's important to understand that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, who just retired, along with Bob Gates, a wonderful Secretary of Defense who just retired, both of them stated in public that the single greatest threat to our national security today, the single greatest threat to our national security today is not Iran, it's not China, it's not North Korea, it's our national debt. That's the greatest threat in their judgment. And yet, what happened this last several months, when President Obama and Speaker of the House, John Boehner, tried to reach some kind of compromise, trying to cut $4 trillion from the debt over the next 10 years, they were bombarded from within their own parties, so much so that the search for a compromise fell apart. And you'll remember the debacle over the debt ceiling, which brought, by the way, the biggest drop in consumer confidence in modern times. It really scared a lot of Americans to watch that. We only got $1 trillion out of it. And at the moment, we are not even close to reaching a compromise. People in both parties have walked away from the Simpson-Bowles plan, a very sensible plan. Neither party's candidates are putting forward a real emphasis on cutting the debt. Look at President Obama's recent budget. It de-emphasizes the debt. And I can tell you that whoever wins the elections this fall, the chances of really getting a serious solution to the debt are receding, not growing. They're diminishing, not growing. So this is a very, very important issue, and restoring civility and conflict resolution to our politics is an imperative for us if we want to protect this nation's future. Now, I must tell you that when I first came to Washington some 40 years ago, just as a kid, Washington was working then. And it was working, in my judgment, as I look back, because it was essentially governed, and the people in charge were the World War II generation. This country was very, very fortunate that we had 7 presidents in a row, from John F. Kennedy through George Bush Sr., Democrats and Republicans, all of whom wore a uniform when they were young in the 1940s. 6 of them were in World War II. It was their defining experiences growing up. Jimmy Carter was in the Naval Academy when the war ended, but he went on to serve honorably as a submariner. But because they had sacrificed for the country when they were young, they brought to public life a spirit of compromise and sacrifice on behalf of a greater good. These people were very different. They understood that there were bigger stakes in life than some of the Mickey Mouse kind of politics that we play today. And yes, they had their differences, and it was not a perfect generation. This was a generation, after all, that did help to bring McCarthy. Joe McCarthy was a World War II veteran. It did bring Vietnam. It did bring Watergate. But if you look overall, the World War II generation, looking back, was one of the finest generations we've had in governance in the country's history. Ton Brokaw rightly called them the greatest generation, and they were in many ways. They were the civic generation. And when they left the scene, America was not only at peace, but we were the strongest nation since the days of ancient Rome in terms of our economic power, our military power, our political influence, and our cultural influence. We were riding high when they left office. We are not riding high today. So I look back with some nostalgia upon that generation. And I would suggest to you that there were 3 qualities that I found in that World War II generation. There were many qualities I found, but there are 3 that I would like to mention tonight that seem to me relevant for this conversation. The first was that they created a climate of civility. In those days, back in the early 70s, when the World War II generation was there, Members of the Congress and the Senate basically lived in Washington. Most of them brought their families there. And they tended to have their kids go to many of the same schools. They worshiped in some of the same churches or synagogues. They often had dinner together. They played golf together on the weekends. And they drank together. And they consumed a fair amount. But the truth was that in those times together, they got to know each other as human beings. In the last few weeks, I've had the opportunity to go pay my respects to Bob Dole, who is, who's one of the last of that World War II generation, to go by and see Bob Michael, who used to be the Republican leader, and to talk with Lee Hamilton, who was retired now as a Democrat. All were there in those years. And they remember countless occasions when they got to be friends with somebody in the other party. When someone took them aside and helped them on the other party. When Lee Hamilton first came to the House of Representatives from Indiana as a Democrat, and he was introducing a bill, and as a rookie, he started making all sorts of rookie mistakes in the way he introduced the bill. It was a Republican from Indiana who pulled him off the floor and said, "Now, Lee, let me help you so you can succeed in the Congress, so you can be a good member of the Congress." Those kind of relationships, just don't develop today. One person after another worked in the Lyndon Johnson White House who worked on the Republican side on the Senate will recall that when Johnson, a Democrat, was in the White House and Ev Dirksen was the Republican leader in the Senate, almost every day Johnson called Dirksen and late in the afternoon to ask him how things are going. How's it going up there? What can we do together? And they used to talk much as half an hour. And it was that relationship, that trust, that helped and was a major, major influence in Johnson being able to get both the Civil Rights Bills of 1964 and 1965 passed with supermajorities in the Senate, with Republicans joining Democrats to produce majorities in favor of civil rights in this country, and it secured both of those bills. Contrast that, if you would, with the inability to get the two parties together on health care, so that what we have in the health care plan is a Democratic passed bill that is now in political football because the Republicans never joined in. They never got them to sign up. Now, you can blame it on the Republicans, you can blame it on the Democrats. The point is they were unable to resolve their differences and produce a bill that both parties could support. And as a result, the health care bill is extraordinarily unstable. The healthcare industry doesn't know where this is going. Insurance companies don't know where this is going. Private companies don't know what their health care bills are going to look like in the future years because we have a bill that is not stable. And that's what comes when you can't resolve conflicts. Now, the second quality that I admired about that group is that they were patriots. They were at heart patriots. When I got there, there were strong Democrats. There were strong Republicans. But they thought of themselves as first and foremost strong Americans. That's what their allegiance was to. And that has changed. It's now the party that often comes first and is put before country as people look at these issues. I can tell you one of the most interesting conversations I ever had with Richard Nixon came toward the end of his life. And he died about 2 or 3 weeks later. We talked by telephone. And he recalled one of his favorite moments in politics. It came early in his political career. Like the others, he came home from the war, took his uniform off, and he ran for office in 1946, ran for the Congress here from Southern California, and was elected. He was elected. It was a big Republican sweep that year. The Republicans took both the House and the Senate. Harry Truman was a beleaguered Democratic president when the Republicans swept into town. That was 1946. The Republicans came in 1947. That's when they took the oath of office. And Truman, by the middle of 1947, saw that Europe was falling apart. And there was very grave danger that if Europe fell apart, communism would make its way across the face of Europe and things would turn bleak, very bleak. And that's the reason that Truman went to George Marshall, as Secretary of State, and said, "Can you put your name on something we're going to call the Marshall Plan?" Now, Truman was so unpopular that he didn't want to put his name on it. Instead, he put Marshall's plan, which was very smart, because Marshall was like the he was like the Colin Powell on steroids of his time. He was a wonderful human being, George Marshall. And that became the Marshall Plan. Now, here's what Nixon said. When the Marshall Plan was first proposed, it was widely opposed by the public. It had only 18% support in the first Gallup poll because it was expensive. Americans were tired of bailing out Europe. But what Truman did was to ask the Republicans to come and help write the Marshall Plan. Got a fellow named Arthur Vandenberg, who was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, a Republican isolationist, famously came and worked at the White House with Harry Truman and with George Marshall and others to write the plan. A lot of other Republicans got involved, and the Republicans, along with the Democrats, went out and told the country, it's important that we do this, it's important we join up. And Nixon said one of the proudest moments in his life came when the Marshall Plan was put to a vote in the House of Representatives in I think it was 1947, and he stood up in favor of it on one side of the aisle. Even though it came from a Democratic president, he stood up in favor of it. And there on the other side of the aisle, also standing up, was another member of the freshman class that year, John F. Kennedy. And Nixon's point is, when the chips are down, we stand up together. And that was the way the politics was practiced. And the contrast with today is startling. It's startling. Now, the one last point I'd like to make is that generation also had a very redeeming grace, and that is it approached life with a sense of humor. And humor can be disarming. Humor can be a lubricant that helps everybody sort of get along and helps us deal with the grimness of life. Life has its dark sides no matter what. But that generation had seen such dark things that it needed humor to sort of get through and to sort of have the human spirit conquer. I used to go out on the trail sometimes with a fellow named Pierre Salinger. Some of you will recall Pierre Salinger. He's a wonderful fellow. He was John F. Kennedy's press secretary. And he liked to recall the time that when he was in his office in the West Wing, and the phone rang one morning about 11 o'clock in the morning, and it was the president. And the president said, "Pierre, come in here. I need to talk to you." "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He walks in the Oval Office. "Pierre, I know you love a good cigar just as much as I do." "Yes, sir, Mr. President." "Well, Pierre, I've got a favor to ask." "What's that, Mr. President?" "Pierre, I need you to get me some Havana's finest cigars." "Well, Mr. President, they're hard to get. How many do you need, and how soon do you need them?" "I need 1,000. And I need them by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Whoa, Mr. President, that's going to be really hard." "Pierre, you're a good man. I know you can do it. See you later." 11 o'clock the next day, phone rings. "Pierre, come in here." Walks in. "Pierre, did you get those cigars?" "Yes, sir, Mr. President. All 1,000 Havana's finest. You're going to love them." "Knew you were a good man, Pierre. See you later." Noon sharp, John F. Kennedy went on nationwide television to declare a trade embargo against Cuba. That's someone with a sense of humor. And he had that. Reagan had that. Reagan had that. You know, Reagan and Tip O'Neill, famously, and Chris Matthews writes about this a lot because he used to work for Tip. But Reagan and Tip used to fight like hell during the day because they were, one's a strong liberal, one's a strong conservative. But at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they could put down their differences and lift up a glass and share old Irish yarns and laugh and scratch and have a good time. And so they developed these bonds of understanding, and they became bonds of affection, even though they were on other sides of the political divide. And they often worked together to get things done. Tip used to say, you know, Reagan will come up here and he'll raise hell with the country, and he'll push to get this big bill through, and finally we'll agree to give him 60% of it, and he'll take 60% of the loaf, go home, and the next day he'll be back up here and he'll want the rest. You know, that's okay. But they worked out the 60%, and they gradually worked it out through the time. So when Tip had a big birthday party, I don't know, I think he turned 70. And And Reagan gave a birthday party for him at the White House and brought a lot of Tip's friends in. It was a luncheon. And when the lunch was over, Reagan got up to give a toast. And he'd written out this little doggerel. He liked to do that. And so he said, Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one too, well, I'd give my ticket back and go to hell with you. That was the spirit of the age. These people sort of liked each other. They had fun with each other. You know, as I said, Bob Dole was the last. Bob Dole was the last. I so much remember the day he walked into his big fancy dinner in Washington called a gridiron dinner. It was all black tie and everything. And there on the dais were 3 former presidents. There was Jerry Ford, let's see, Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Richard Nixon. Dole walks in and said, look up there. See no evil. Hear no evil. And evil. And Dole loved Richard Nixon. Some of you were perhaps at San Clemente for the funeral, but Dole gave a eulogy there. We all wept. But he never let anything serious get in the way of a good one-liner. He used to tell the story. He was the last World War II veteran to run for the presidency. He ran in 1996 against Bill Clinton. Didn't have a chance. He knew it. But he ran a gallant campaign. But he used to tell the story about campaigning in New Hampshire. Went into a nursing home looking for votes. And he went around and started shaking hands with people. And all he got was a lot of blank stares. And finally went up to a woman in a wheelchair and looked at her and said, ma'am, do you know who I am? And she said, no, but if you ask at the front desk, maybe they can tell you. We need that again. We need to be able to laugh together. We need to be able to have a politics that is civil. We need a politics in which the country becomes front and center again. Because this country needs help. We all know that. We celebrate the lives of these young people who come in here today. But what kind of futures do they really have, and so many of their friends really have? Through dance, they can perhaps they can transform themselves. But there are so many other kids like them who don't have an equal shot in this country right now, who don't have an equal chance. And we pledged ourselves in the beginning that everybody would have equal chance, equal shot. And we know that that's not out there now. We've got a lot of kids who are hurting. We're not able to compete with the Japanese or the Chinese. We're seeing these jobs go overseas. The middle class is suffering terribly. A new book just out by Charles Murray on what's been happening to the middle class. The upper middle class is fine. The upper middle class, parents are mostly sticking together. Their kids are getting educated. Most of the kids are going on to college. Most of the families in here, upper middle class. And everybody's going to be fine. The drug problems are not too serious. The drinking problems are not too serious. Income levels are fine. Everybody's pretty secure. You're not on the street. You're not in danger of going on the street. But the middle class, the working people in this country, it is totally different. And what Murray has found is that if you look at what's going on in the working class, is that the culture is falling apart. For too many, there are too many kids now who are growing up, being born out of wedlock. The numbers are unbelievably high. There are too many kids who are growing up with a single mom. There are too many kids who are not making it out of high school. These working class kids are not able to go to college. They're not ready for college. There are very few institutions around them anymore. Used to be the Catholic Church in the neighborhoods, organizations that looked after kids. A lot of those organizations have disappeared. And the families are living right on the edge economically. Not sure when that next payment is going to be there. We got a lot of people hurting in this country, and to restore that, we're going to have to pull our politics back together because we have so much big work to do. Now, I just want to end with this one note, and I'm sorry if I've kept you too long. We talk a lot about the politician, and it's vital that that we have better leaders. And by the way, I think help is on the way. I think there are some more people coming into politics who are very promising. And the younger generation, the veterans coming back, the social entrepreneurs, Teach for America types, I'm on board for Teach for America. There are a lot of these young people coming back, many of them your sons and daughters. We've got help on the way. But in the meantime, we've got to get better leaders in Washington in the next few years. But I would argue this one last point. The capacity for our leaders to succeed, to govern, is going to depend not just upon them, but the quality of the citizenry. Leaders have to have good followers. There has to be a sort of a partnership between the people, the citizens of a country, and the people we send and entrust with national power. Now, it's really interesting. After the American Civil War and the French Civil War, American Revolution and the French Revolution, Thomas Jefferson asked the question, why did the American Revolution succeed and the French Revolution fail? One led to democracy, the other led to tyranny. What was the difference? And he said, actually, it wasn't in the leadership. It was in the quality of the citizenship. That in America, when the revolution came, there were many, many Americans who lived in towns and villages where they had practiced democracy for a long time. They had practiced self-government. They knew how to act in a democracy, and they accepted and loved democracy. And they embraced it after the revolution. Whereas in France, people had lived under a monarch, they'd lived under kings. In Jefferson's view, the religious leadership had been oppressive. And the result was they had not lived with freedom before, and they weren't ready for it, and it led to tyranny. And Jefferson's conclusion is that the quality of a democracy depends heavily upon the quality of the citizenship. And today, frankly, there are too many of us who are not pulling our own weight and providing and building a climate in which leadership can thrive. Now, I would have to tell you right up front that part of the problem is in the press. I spent a lot of time in the media. And I plead guilty to this because I think that too many of us in the media have wandered away from having serious conversations about what's really facing us as a country, and we're looking for the ratings, and we're giving you a lot of stuff to titillate you, to keep you sort of entertained, but not to help and understanding. And, you know, we want the ratings, but in the chase for ratings, you know, something is lost, and that is the quality of conversation and who gets represented. I can tell you that I've talked to one senator after another recently, and I've been talking to a lot of people trying to understand what's going on. And one senator after another who is a moderate will tell you, I have been called several times to be on this show or that show representing my party. And then the producers call me and ask me what I've got to say, and they realize I want to work with the other side, and they say, we'll take a rain check. And they get dropped for somebody who is on the far end of their party. They want the extremist on one side, and they want the extremist on the other side so we can get a food fight going. And by the way, that's what Americans watch. And we have to, you can't just blame the media. The media's looking for ratings, but what does the people want to read? And that is an issue. So it's partly the press. I've been very fortunate. I've had the experience of working for some first-class news organizations, starting with McNeil-Lehrer some years ago, and now associated with CNN. And I do really think that both of them tried. And there were some in between that, like Ted Koppel, I worked with, and I think really have tried hard. But the fact is that we in the press should be much more constructive in our approach toward democracy and in the seriousness with which we take our work. But but it is also a question of an engaged citizenship. And people who are going to not only vote, but stay engaged and be active. What's happened is that, and Bob Putnam, who's a sociologist, wonderful sociologist at Harvard, has made this argument. What's happened is we had broad-scale civic engagement through the 50s, 60s, but something then began to happen, and a lot of people in the middle started disengaging from our civic community, from organizations, you know, like the Kiwanis Club, the various boys clubs and girls clubs, and others. There were some who stayed engaged, but a lot of people got disengaged, and the people who remained engaged were those at the edges, on the extremes. But, you know, the people on the right and the left who cared deeply about it, there's nothing wrong with that. Having people on the extreme, nothing wrong with that, but when they're the only voices out there, when they dominate your primaries, you've got a problem. You know, look at what's happened to the Republicans in all these debates. You know, they've gotten themselves pulled more and more to the right because that's the group that's very active in the Republican Party. That's similarly true in the Democratic Party. You get pulled more and more to the left. And what we need are people in the middle class, in the working class, in the upper middle class of this country to get more engaged. And so and to build communities of civility. And it brings us back, doesn't it not, to the reason we're all here tonight. And that is to celebrate this National Center. Because what this center is all about, and what the attempt here is about, is to build a community of civility here in San Diego and beyond. It's noble work. And for all of you who are engaged with this, I thank you for this award. But most of all, I thank you for what you're doing for the country. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. No. Thank you.